Rain lashed the glass walls of the 40th floor penthouse on Magnificent Mile, smearing the city lights into long ribbons of gold. Inside, Claire Harmon sat motionless in her titanium wheelchair, the cashmere blanket across her legs, arranged by hands that were not her own, as it had been arranged every morning for 20 years. Across the marble floor, the slow, even sweep of a mop traced quiet arcs through the lamplight. Ray Calloway worked without looking up, his gray uniform damp at the cuffs, his split knuckles catching against the handle. He was a man with nothing left to lose, and a son whose name he whispered each night like a prayer. Then his eyes drifted across the steel brace strapped to her spine, and he stopped breathing. 14 specialists had stood where he was standing now. None of them had seen it. The mop stopped against the marble. Across the room, the technician, a young man in surgical whites, clicked another notch tighter on the brace that cradled Claire Harmon's spine. She drew breath through her teeth. The technician did not look up. His voice carried the practiced flatness of someone trained to treat a body as a machine, and nothing more. "One more, Mrs. Harmon. Doctor's orders." Ray watched the curve of the steel. He had spent 11 years designing bridges across the Mississippi, and a man who has spent 11 years calculating where weight should go cannot unsee where weight should not. The brace narrowed at the lumbar, narrowed where it ought to have widened, concentrated where it ought to have dispersed. Every pound of pressure those straps carried was funneling toward a single point at the base of her spine. It was the kind of mistake a first-year student would not make, which meant it was not a mistake at all. He should have kept his mouth shut. He had a son at home, a heating bill 3 weeks late, a name on a janitorial roster that could be erased before sunrise. He cleared his throat anyway. "Ma'am, that brace is wrong." The technician's hands froze. Claire turned her head with the slow precision of a woman accustomed to being interrupted only by men who could afford the consequences. Her gaze traveled from the cracked boots to the white thread on his chest that read, "Calloway." "Excuse me, the load distribution. It's wrong." His voice steadied as the words came. A spinal orthotic that size should spread weight to the iliac crests and shoulders. Yours is funneling everything into a single vertebra. Looks like L4 or L5. "I used to design bridges. You build a column, that way it collapses inside a year." The silence that followed did not invite reply. It closed around the room like a fist. Claire's mouth thinned. 20 years of pity from strangers, 20 years of well-meaning men telling her what her own body could and could not do, had taught her to recognize the species. She had learned to crush it on sight. "And what is your medical degree, Mr. Calloway?" "I don't have one." "Then you'll forgive me if I take the advice of the team that does." Her hand moved to the small intercom on the armrest. "Stewart, would you come up? Please." He arrived inside 2 minutes, which was the first thing Ray noticed. A man did not arrive at a 40th floor penthouse inside 2 minutes unless he lived in the building. Stewart Holt stepped out of the private elevator in a charcoal suit, cut on the same block as Claire's blouse. His silver hair brushed back from a face groomed into a particular kind of patience. He took in the scene, the technician, the janitor, the rigid set of Claire's shoulders, and offered the gentle smile of a man indulging a misunderstanding. "What seems to be the trouble, dear?" "This man is offering me orthopedic advice." Holt turned. He looked at Ray a long moment, and Ray understood at once that he was being measured not as a person, but as a variable, as a thing to be folded back into a system. "My apologies, mister." A glance at the patch. "Calloway. I'm sure you meant well. The brace is a custom fabrication, carbon fiber composite proprietary geometry. Mrs. Harmon's case is unusually delicate." The smile widened fractionally. "Why don't we let you finish your rounds?" Ray said nothing. He picked up the mop. He pushed it across the marble toward the service elevator, and he felt Holt's eyes on the back of his neck the entire way. 20 years before, on a stretch of Interstate 90, west of Chicago, a black sedan had crossed 3 lanes in a January whiteout and met Claire Harmon's coupe on the driver's side. She had been 24. She had been driving home from her first board meeting at her father's company. She woke in a hospital room 6 days later to find that her legs no longer answered, and that her father, Edward Harmon, founder of Harmon Med Group, a man who had built a pharmaceutical empire out of one warehouse on the South Side, was sitting beside her bed, holding her hand, and weeping in a way she had never seen a man weep. He died of a stroke 2 years later. The grief, the doctors said, had hollowed something out in him. Before he died, he took Claire's hand again and pressed it into the hand of his most trusted protege, the brilliant young physician he had personally trained since residency. "Stuart will look after you," he had said. "Stuart will never lie to you." And then the lights of his eyes had gone out. Stuart Holt had been 29 years old. He had grown into his role with the patience of a man cultivating a garden. Over the years, he filtered every specialist who approached her, screened every second opinion, sat in on every consultation. Whenever a new doctor surfaced, a name from Mayo, a neurologist from Stanford, some young surgeon trumpeting a procedure in a journal, Holt would arrive in her office with the same gentle face and the same gentle phrase. "Claire, false hope is the most refined poison there is. They see your name. They see your bank account. They will sell you a miracle and a wheelchair to roll yourself into the grave with." She had heard it so often in so many tones that she had stopped questioning it. She had stopped questioning anything. Now she sat in her penthouse and tried to remember the last time a man had told her she was wrong about her own body. She could not. 40 floors below in the executive suite, the company kept dark. After 7, Holt closed the door of his office and stood for a long moment at the window. Across the desk lay a leather binder embossed with 2 crests, the silver caduceus of Harmon Med Group, and beside it, the white cross of Vesalius Pharma Geneva. The merger documents had arrived that morning by courier. $12 billion. The largest pharmaceutical consolidation in the Western Hemisphere. 6 weeks until the closing date. He turned to the clause his late mentor had inserted 30 years earlier, the clause Edward Harmon had believed would protect his daughter, and which Stuart Holt had spent 2 decades quietly turning into a key. All corporate actions of significance shall require the signature of the controlling Harmon heir, save in the event that a duly convened medical board shall certify said heir incompetent to lead, in which case authority shall devolve to the chief medical officer. He closed the binder. He did not need to read further. He had read it every day for 18 years. The intercom chimed. He pressed the button without turning. "Yes. Sir, the night janitor on 40. Do you want him terminated?" He considered it. A janitor making noise about a brace was a small thing. A janitor who suddenly disappeared was a slightly larger thing, the kind of thing that left a thread for someone someday to pull. He had not survived 2 decades of this work by leaving threads. "No," he said. "Leave him on the schedule. I want to know which floors he cleans and at what hours. That will be all." Ray came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. And on the 3rd Tuesday, Claire was in her office at 11 at night alone, and she did not order him out. He cleaned around her. He emptied the bin beside her desk, wiped the glass of the conference table, replaced the liner in the bathroom, and did not speak. On the 4th night, she finally lifted her eyes from her screen. "You said L4 or L5. He looked up surprised. "I did." "Why?" He set down the cloth. "Because it's where the brace narrows. Because it's where they put the medicated patches. Because if you wanted to pin one specific nerve root in place, keep it from healing, keep it inflamed, that's where you'd put the pressure. I'm not saying that's what's happening. I'm saying that's how the thing is built." She watched him for a while. She did not invite him to sit. She did not need to. He went back to his cloth. After that, he came every weeknight, and somewhere in the second month, she began to leave her door open. He told her in pieces the things a man tells a stranger because a stranger does not require him to perform. He told her about the bridge contract he had lost when his firm restructured. He told her about Sarah, about how her hair had thinned in clumps on the pillowcase, and how she had laughed at it anyway. He told her about the doctor who had stayed awake 3 nights in a row, arguing with a hospital review board to keep Sarah in treatment, a man named Walter Grimes, whose license had been suspended the following month for violations of financial protocol, and who now, last Ray had heard, was running a machine shop on the South Side and refusing to speak about medicine to anyone. He told her about Owen, 9 years old, autoimmune, the specific protocol his immunologist had begged Meridian Blue Health to approve, and the form letters that came back with the same word stamped in red across the bottom. He did not tell her because he did not know that Meridian Blue Health was a wholly owned subsidiary of Harmon Med Group. He did not tell her because he did not know that the algorithm that printed the word "denied" on his son's file had been approved 5 years earlier in a boardroom 3 floors below them. Claire listened. For the first time in 2 decades, she found herself curious about a human being, not as a problem, not as a contract, as a person. And lying alone in the dark of her bedroom that night, with the brace humming faintly against her spine, she found herself thinking about the curve of a steel bar and about a stranger in a gray uniform who had looked at her body and seen something 14 specialists had not. The blueprints were on the desk by accident. Tuesday night, 12:15. Executive floor 38, Ray was emptying the recycling bin in the small conference room when his hand brushed a leather portfolio that had been left half open beside a cold cup of coffee. He should not have looked. He looked. The top sheet was a technical schematic. Spinal orthotic lateral cross-section dimensions in millimeters manufacturer's stamp, clipped at the corner, Heritage Biomechanical, a name he did not recognize registered in Wilmington. The drawing showed exactly what he had seen on the woman in the wheelchair 40 floors above. Reinforced steel ribs along the lower spine, a narrow pressure cone at the L4 to L5 junction, and drawn neatly in cross-hatching where the orthotic would seat against skin. 6 small rectangular pads labeled in clinical shorthand he did not need to translate. Active matrix, continuous delivery. Replace at 30-day intervals. Active delivery of what? He stood with the page in his hand for what felt like a long time. He thought about Sarah. He thought about the form letters with the red stamp. He thought about a man in a charcoal suit who had arrived at a 40th floor penthouse inside 2 minutes, and about the gentle fatherly voice that had asked him to finish his rounds. He folded the page in half. He folded it again. He slid it inside his uniform shirt against his ribs, and he went back to his cart. She was in her office the next night. She was alone. He set down his bucket. He did not push the mop. He took the page from his shirt and laid it flat on her desk, and stepped back, and he watched her read. Her face did not change. Her face hadn't changed in 20 years, but her hand moved very slowly to the edge of the paper and held it there as if it might lift in a draft. "Where did you find this?" Claire's voice was level. "Conference room on 38. Last night. On a desk. On a desk." She did not look up. "Mr. Calloway, I would like you to leave my office." He left. He was halfway across the lobby when the security men met him. 2 of them polite, expressionless, choreographed. One held out a hand. Ray gave him the key card. The other carried the small cardboard box with his lunchbox and his spare gloves, and the photograph of Owen he kept taped inside his locker. They walked him out into the rain on Michigan Avenue without a word, and they stood at the doors until he had crossed the street. He stood under an awning for a long time watching the lights of the 40th floor. She did not sleep. She sat in her chair by the window and watched the rain unspool against the glass, and she thought about the schematic and she thought about Stuart's voice, and she thought about her father. The brace hummed faintly against her spine, the way it always did a sensation she had stopped feeling years ago, in the way one stops feeling a wedding ring. At 3 a.m, she rolled herself into the dressing room and locked the door. She had never undressed without help. The technicians did it. The night nurse did it. For 20 years, no fingers but theirs had touched the buckles. Her hands shook. The first strap came loose with a soft tearing sound, and the second, and when the front plate of the brace fell open against her ribs, she sat for a long time, looking down at her own skin in the lamplight. The pads were exactly where the schematic said they would be. 6 of them the size of postage stamps, beige and almost invisible against her flesh. She lifted the corner of one with her thumbnail. The cold was instantaneous. It bloomed outward from the patch in a slow chemical wave, climbing her ribs, sliding down toward her hip, and then for the first time in 20 years, sliding past her hip, past the line where sensation was supposed to end, down into the dead country of her thigh, her knee the arch of her foot. It was not warmth, it was not feeling. It was the absence of an absence, a numbness lifting off skin that had been numb so long she had forgotten there was anything underneath. She pressed the patch back down. Her hand was trembling. A memory rose then, one she had not retrieved in 18 years. Her father in his hospital bed, the morphine drip in his arm, the small brass key on the chain around his neck. He had taken it off and pressed it into her palm with fingers already stiff. Sweetheart. Stuart's safe, behind the Pollock in his office. Don't open it. Don't ever open it. Unless there's no other door. She had thought at the time he was confused. He had been confused about many things in those last days. She had taken the key home and put it in a velvet pouch in the drawer of her vanity, and she had not thought about it since. She rolled across the carpet to the vanity and opened the drawer. The pouch was where she had left it. The key was inside. She moved the next morning. She told Stuart she wanted a full review of the Vesalius integration plan, the long version, every annex, every regulatory contingency. He smiled and agreed, and walked her through to the boardroom himself, and at 9:15 the door closed, and she settled in for a meeting she had no intention of absorbing a single word of. Margaret Whitlock had served Edward Harmon before she had served Claire, and Margaret was the only person in the building Claire trusted absolutely. The text Claire sent her at 9:16 contained 4 words and a key. Stuart's office. Pollock. Now. At 10:02, while Stuart was deep in the third quarter capital flow projections, Margaret walked into Claire's private study with a leather satchel and laid 3 folders on the desk. Claire returned at 11:45. Margaret was gone. The folders were waiting. She opened the first. Heritage Biomechanical, incorporated in Wilmington, Delaware in 2008. Sole director and beneficial owner, Stuart M. Holt. Patent registry for a Class 3 spinal orthotic device, the brace she had worn against her body day and night for the last 18 years. The royalty stream listed in the annual filings was $11 million. Per year. She opened the second. Trial logs. Compound designation along alphanumeric string she did not recognize. Synthesis notes. Animal protocols. The molecule was a synthetic neurotoxin engineered for a single purpose, induced sustained reversible paralysis of the lower lumbar nerve roots delivered via dermal patch at controlled dosage. There was a column labeled Human Subject. The column had a single entry. CHF 24 post-traumatic. She read her own initials 4 times before her hand stopped shaking enough to turn the page. She opened the third. The letterhead was Johns Hopkins. The date was March of 2007. The author was a name she had heard once a long time ago on a list of specialists Stuart had quietly dismissed as an opportunist. Patient Claire Harmon, age 25, presents with paraplegia, secondary to motor vehicle accident, January 2006. Imaging review reveals incomplete cord injury at L4 to L5, with significant residual axonal viability. Surgical decompression with anticipated full motor recovery is strongly indicated within an 18-month therapeutic window. The accident had been temporary. She had been able to walk. She had always been able to walk. The window had closed in 2008, and Stuart Holt had spent every year since then refining the chemistry that kept her in her chair. She set the folder down and looked at her hands. They were a stranger's hands. Everything in this room belonged to a stranger. She did not weep. She had forgotten how. She picked up the third folder and read it again from the beginning, and she understood with the clarity of a woman who had run a pharmaceutical empire for 2 decades exactly what kind of man she had let raise her since the day her father died. That night, she tore off the brace. She did it on the floor of her bedroom because she could not trust the bed. The bed had sensors in the frame. She knew that now. She knew everything had sensors now. And she lay on the rug and pulled the patches off one by one. The chemical wave that had touched her thigh the night before came back as a tide. It was not numbness lifting. It was every nerve that had been silenced for 2 decades, waking up at once, screaming into a body that had forgotten how to receive them. Pins. Fire. Ice. The sensation of falling from a great height through her own legs. She bit down on the cuff of her own sleeve and made no sound because she did not know who in the building was Stuart's and who was not, and because the only thing she had left was the fact that he did not yet know that she knew. She could not call her medical team. They were his. She could not call the police. Not yet. She had folders, and she had patches, and she had a story that sounded on first telling like the breakdown of a wealthy invalid. She could not stand. She could not crawl. She could barely breathe through the fire in her hips. She lay on the rug and watched the ceiling, and outside the great window, the first thick flakes of a Chicago snowstorm began to drift past the glass. 40 floors down and 3 blocks east in his office at the corner of Wabash. Stuart Holt was watching a screen. The screen showed 6 green vital sign traces, transmitted in real time from the sensors woven into the brace he had designed. Heart rate, respiration, skin temperature. 3 independent measures of dermal contact at the patch sites. For 18 years, the contact readings had been unbroken green. Tonight, all 6 had gone red. He sat very still. He looked at the calendar on his desk. 4 weeks to closing. 4 weeks to $12 billion. And the corner office on the executive floor, with his name on the door, 4 weeks, to the empire Edward Harmon had promised him in everything but the will. He had planned for this. He had always planned for this. The medical incompetence route required a board, and a board required time. And time was the one thing he no longer had. He picked up the phone. The number was one he had memorized long ago, kept ready against an emergency he had hoped never to need. The wind came up against the window. The first siren of the night cut through the loop. Out across Magnificent Mile, the lights began to flicker once, twice, and then in a single rolling wave the grid went dark. He smiled faintly, the smile of a man whose fortune has saved him the trouble of arranging it himself. "Tonight," he said into the phone. "She's alone, no power. Make it look like she fell in the dark." The map on Ray's phone bloomed red. He had been sitting on the couch with Owen tucked into his side, the boy's head heavy against his ribs, a forgotten cartoon flickering on the muted screen. Outside, the wind had been climbing against the windows of the small 2-bedroom in Bridgeport for an hour. 11 years of cleaning floors downtown had taught him to track the city's grid, the way a sailor tracks weather every storm shift, every brownout, every flicker on the utility map he kept open on his phone. The power had stayed on in their block. The grid west of Halstead always did whatever the weather, but every few minutes Ray refreshed the tracker out of habit, the way a man checks a wound he is no longer sure is healing. The patch over Magnificent Mile was solid red, not flickering, not partial, solid. The grid had not failed across that district in the 11 years he had worked nights downtown, not in any storm, not in any heat wave. He looked at the screen, and he looked at the snow falling past the street lamp outside his window, and a cold thing turned over slowly in his chest. He carried Owen to the apartment across the hall. Mrs. Delgado opened the door in her bathrobe and asked no questions. She had raised 4 boys alone and recognized a father in a hurry at midnight when she saw one. Ray kissed his son's forehead. Owen did not wake. He took the stairs 2 at a time. The Lakeshore Drive was a tunnel of white. His wipers labored, pushed back, labored again. He drove with both hands and a jaw locked tight. And when he reached the service entrance of the Magnificent Mile Tower, the security gate stood dead in its frame, the keypad black. He left the truck in the loading dock and went in through the dock door on foot. The lobby was dark. His old keycard was in a box on someone's security desk now, but he did not need a card to find a stairwell. He took the service stairs, 40 floors. The emergency lights along the railings had failed with the rest of the building. He climbed in, pitch dark, one hand on the rail, his breath ragged by the 20th landing, his thighs burning by the 30th. He did not stop. Sarah had taught him in her last months what it cost to stop. He thought about Sarah climbing the small flight of 3 steps onto their porch the week before she died, refusing his arm, refusing the rail, climbing them on her own because she had decided she would. At the 40th landing, he leaned against the steel door and listened. Boots. 2 pairs, maybe 3, already inside. He had a crowbar in his belt that he had taken from the bed of the truck, the same crowbar he had used 1,000 times to lever open shipping crates of bridge fittings in another life. He fit the curve of it into the seam of the service door, and he set his shoulder, and he opened the penthouse the way a man opens a thing that is not meant to be opened. She was on the bedroom floor where she had fallen. The men in the corridor had not yet found her. The floor plan was complicated. The dark was complete, and they had been told to look for a woman in a chair. They were looking in the chair. Ray crossed the carpet on his knees. He found her hand by touch and pressed his palm flat over her mouth before she could make a sound, and she did not make one, because the moment her fingers closed around his wrist, she knew the wrist. He lifted her. She weighed less than he had expected and more than her body should have. He carried her down the service hall, away from the voices, through the kitchen, into the laundry, and out the small back stairwell. The night staff used the one no one in a tailored suit had ever bothered to memorize. They went down 40 floors in the dark together. Halfway down, she began to shake, not from cold, but from the chemical fire still moving through her legs. And he stopped on a landing and held her until it passed, and then they kept going. The shop sat behind a chain-link fence at the corner of Throop and 47th. A hand-lettered sign over the roll-up door read, "Grimes Machine and Fab in Paint," that had been white once. Inside, the air smelled of cutting oil and old coffee, and a man in his 60s, with a gray beard and forearms like cable, was hunched over a lathe at 3 in the morning because sleep no longer came to him the way it came to other men. He looked up when the side door opened, and he looked at the woman in Ray's arms, and he looked at Ray's face, and he set down the calipers without a word. Walter Grimes had not practiced medicine in 7 years. He had not asked to. The night the hospital review board had taken his license, he had walked out of the building, driven to a storage unit in Cicero, and pulled out the box of his late father's machinist tools that he had not opened since college. He had told himself he was finished with medicine. He had told himself for 7 years. And then a man whose wife he had failed to save walked into his shop, carrying a billionaire who could not feel her own legs. And the lie he had been telling himself for 7 years fell off him like a coat in a warm room. "Lay her on the bench," Walter said. "Get me the green case from under the workbench, the one with the Red Cross sticker." Ray got the case. The detoxification took 6 weeks. It took 6 weeks because Walter would not let it take less. He set up an IV stand made out of a welding rod and a coat hook. He titrated a saline and chelator drip from a textbook he had not opened since residency, and he ran it slower than a hospital would have run it, because a hospital would have been moving a patient toward discharge, and Walter was moving a patient back toward a body. The neurotoxin had embedded itself in the myelin sheath of every nerve below her waist for 2 decades. It did not come out clean. It came out the way rust comes out of an old engine flake, by flake, with heat and patience and a great deal of pain. The first week she could not sit up. The second week she could sit up, and she could move the toes of her right foot, and the first time the small toes curled against the wool blanket Ray had thrown over the bench, she made a sound that was not quite laughter, and not quite anything else. Walter wrote it down in a notebook he had begun keeping again for the first time in 7 years. The third week Ray began to build. He welded a pair of parallel bars out of 2-inch steel pipe, scavenged from the back lot, set them at the height of her hips, padded the rails with strips of an old saddle blanket. The first time she put weight on her own legs, she lasted 4 seconds before her knees folded and she went down into Ray's arms with a cry torn out of her that was 20 years old. The second time she lasted 6, the third time 11. There was no miracle in it. There was a woman who had been sitting still for 2 decades, teaching her body to remember a thing it had been chemically forbidden to remember. And there was a man with split knuckles standing at the end of the bars with his hands open. And there was an old doctor watching from a folding chair with a notebook on his knee. And there was the smell of cutting oil, and there was time. Owen came in the afternoons after the school bus dropped him at the corner. He did his homework on an upside-down crate near the bench. He did not ask questions about the woman with the careful, slow legs and the silver hair pinned back from her face. He had been raised in a house where adults were sometimes sick, and there were sometimes things one did not ask about, and he had absorbed that quiet early. In the 4th week, he brought her a drawing. He had done it in colored pencil on the back of a math worksheet. It showed a woman with dark hair standing upright, with one hand on a railing, and beside her, a wheelchair, drawn empty, the wheels at a slight tilt, as if she had just stood up out of it. Across the top in the careful, uneven block, letters of a boy who had practiced his handwriting that morning. He had written, "You stood up." He held it out to her with both hands. She took it. "My mom had to use a chair, too," Owen said. At the end, she told me one time she said standing up wasn't the hard part. She said the hard part was believing you were going to. The thing that broke in Claire Harmon then had been holding for 20 years. And when it broke without sound. Her shoulders bent forward over the drawing in her lap, and the tears that came were not the tears of a woman crying about a thing in front of her. They were the tears of a woman who had not been crying for a long time, and was now all at once crying for the entire stretch of it. Owen put his small hand on her wrist and did not move it. Ray stood at the workbench with his back to them and did not turn around. That night, after the boy had gone home to sleep at Mrs. Delgado's, and Walter had folded himself into the camp bed, in the back office Claire took from the bench beside her the manila folder Ray carried in the pocket of his coat at all times. She had asked to see it that morning. She had not been able to look at it then. She opened it now. Owen Calloway. Date of birth. Diagnosis, a long autoimmune name she had heard 1,000 times in product meetings. The recommended biologic protocol. The denial letter from Meridian Blue Health, 18 months old. A second denial. A third. The same sentence on each generated by the same engine. Treatment does not meet criteria for medical necessity per standard utilization review. She knew the engine. She remembered the meeting. 2020, summer, the small conference room on 36. Stewart had walked her through the slide deck himself. Margin optimization through automated prior authorization. 86% denial rate on first submission. The economics are extraordinary, Claire. You sign this and we save the company $40 million a year. She had signed it. She had signed it because her own chief medical officer had recommended it, and because her own chief medical officer had never lied to her. That was the phrase she had carried with her for 2 decades. Stewart will never lie to you. She sat in the dark of the machine shop with the folder open on her knees, and she understood finally, and without comfort, that she had not been the only victim of the man her father had handed her to. She had been his instrument. The denial stamp on this child's file had passed across her own desk, wearing her own signature. The boy on the floor of his own apartment sleeping with a cartoon on the muted screen, she had failed him before she had ever met him. She closed the folder. She did not cry again. There would be time for crying. Right now there was something else to do. The board of Harmon Med Group convened at 10 in the morning on a Thursday in the 17th floor conference room of the Wabash Tower. Stewart Holt sat at the head of the table in a dark wool suit cut to the line of his shoulders. The Vesalius delegation sat to his right, 4 men in identical Geneva tailoring, with 2 unsigned copies of a $12 billion merger agreement spread flat on the rosewood. The board's medical certification of Claire Harmon's incapacity to lead the document Stewart had spent 6 weeks assembling out of his own falsified records lay in a leather portfolio at his elbow. He was opening the meeting when the door at the far end of the room opened. She walked in on aluminum forearm crutches. She walked in slowly. 5 steps from the door to the head of the table. The first step took her 7 seconds. The second was steadier. By the third, the room had gone so silent that the only sound in it was the small click of the rubber tip of a crutch against the parquet. And by the fifth was the one that took her past Stewart Holt's chair to the seat at the head of the table that her father had built. There was not a man at the table breathing. 5 steps, 20 years. Ray came in behind her in a navy suit that had hung in his closet since his old firm and still fit at the shoulders. He laid a folder down in front of each of the 14 board members. Heritage Biomechanical Wilmington. Trial logs of compound delivery. The Johns Hopkins consultation of March 2007. Toxicology assays on the patches that had been taken off Claire's body in the dressing room of a 40th floor penthouse 6 weeks earlier and frozen ever since in a cooler in Walter Grimes's machine shop. Stewart's face did not move. Stewart's face had not moved in 20 years. The doors at both ends of the conference room opened at the same time. The men in the windbreakers at the main door wore FBI in yellow letters across the back. The 2 officers at the service door were Chicago police. Stewart looked at the service door, and the service door was where he tried to go, and the service door was where they put the cuffs on him. He did not speak as they walked him out. He looked once briefly at Claire, the way a man looks at a piece of equipment that has performed unexpectedly, and then he was gone. She turned to the board. She canceled the merger inside the hour. She ordered the immediate suspension of every automated denial pipeline at Meridian Blue Health, effective close of business that day, with manual reprocessing of every claim flagged in the prior 36 months. The first file pulled from the queue for human review by her direct instruction was the one belonging to a 9-year-old boy in Bridgeport. Spring came late to Evanston that year. The house she had bought was 1 story, set back from the street under 2 old oaks, with broad south-facing windows and a porch that ran the width of the front and a garden in back that ended at a low wooden fence. There was not a stair anywhere on the property. She had checked. Walter Grimes's medical license had been restored in February. He was teaching emergency response seminars again, and he had moved into a small apartment over a bakery in Hyde Park, and he came for dinner on Sundays. Ray had taken the position at Harmon Med Group that Claire had created for him. Head of biomechanical engineering, the orthotics division, and he had moved into a house 6 blocks away with Owen, and Owen had not had a flare in 9 months. On a Saturday afternoon in May, she sat on the porch with a wooden cane laid across her lap. The cane was hickory. It was the only mobility aid she used now, and she used it less every week. In the yard, Ray was chasing his son across the new grass. Owen ran in the wide, loose ovals of a healthy 9-year-old, laughing the laugh of a boy who had forgotten what it was to be sick, and Ray ran behind him with his arms out and his head thrown back, and the late sun caught the leaves of the oaks and threw them golden across the lawn. She set the cane aside. She put her bare feet down on the boards of the porch. The wood was warm. Beneath the wood was the foundation, and beneath the foundation was the earth. And after 20 years, for the first time, Claire Harmon felt the ground hold her.